Before going to shoot, make sure you have all of the equipment you'll need: the camera, charged batteries, and a memory card with enough room for your shoot. Move the camera's power switch to on to shoot still images. To choose the shooting mode, use the mode dial on the top of the camera. The shooting modes vary from fully automatic to fully manual. The basic modes are semi-automatic modes, in which the camera is making all or most of the decisions in the picture-taking process. In fully automatic mode, the camera analyzes the scene and chooses the best settings. The camera even decides what to focus on and whether or not to fire the flash. The flash disabled mode is identical to fully automatic mode, except that the camera will not allow the flash to fire. The creative auto mode allows the user to make some decisions, such as whether or not the background is blurry. To access the menu, press the Q button on the back of the camera. Use the arrows to make a selection, and then press Set. In portrait mode, the camera uses a large aperture in order to blur out the background behind the person in focus. This emphasizes the person and minimizes the background distractions. Landscape mode uses a small aperture, which allows both the foreground and the background to be in focus. Close-up mode is used to photograph small things such as flowers up close. In sports mode, the camera maintains a fast shutter speed in order to stop action and avoid blurring. The SCN modes includes more special shooting situations, including night portraits and backlighting. Although the automatic modes can be useful, it is highly recommended, if not required by your journalism course, that you learn to control the camera manually. Before using the manual modes, the user must understand what's called the exposure triangle, which is comprised of ISO, or film speed, shutter speed, and aperture. ISO, or film speed, is essentially how sensitive the camera's sensor is to light. The lower the ISO number, the less sensitive the camera is to light. The less sensitive the camera is to light, the more time and more light the camera needs to make a photograph. The higher the ISO number, the less time and less light the camera needs. For example, ISO 100 would be an appropriate setting to take photos on Appian Way in bright sunlight, whereas 3200 would be appropriate for photographing in a dark classroom. It's important to note that the higher the ISO number, the more digital noise will show up in the photograph. To change the ISO, press the ISO button on the top of the camera. Use the main dial to select the desired speed and press the Set button. The second piece of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. Shutter speed is how much time the camera lets light in for. The shutter speed is the first number from the left when looking through the viewfinder. The shutter speed number refers to how quickly the shutter opens and closes. For example, a shutter speed of 8,000 will open the shutter for 1/8,000th of a second. So the higher the number, the faster the shutter speed. A fast shutter speed will help to stop action. The faster the shutter speed, the less chance of motion blur. It's recommended that you always shoot with a shutter speed higher than 60 or 1/60th of a second in order to reduce the chances of camera shake. The third piece of the exposure triangle is aperture, which determines how much light is being let in. The aperture is an adjustable opening inside the lens. While looking through the viewfinder, the aperture setting is the second number from the left and is usually between 4 and 32. The smaller the aperture number, the larger the aperture opening, and the more light is being let in. The larger the aperture number, the smaller the aperture opening, and less light is being let in. Aperture affects the photo in a couple of ways. First is focus. A large aperture, or a low number, will cause less of the foreground and background of the image to be in focus. A small aperture, or a higher number, will cause more of the background and the foreground to be in focus. Second, the aperture will affect the shutter speed. If the aperture is large, more light is being let in. The more light the camera has to work with, the faster the shutter speed can be. Conversely, a small aperture will let less light in and require a slower shutter speed. The manual modes allow for the user to control most to all of the camera's settings. In program mode, the user controls some things such as flash and ISO, while the camera controls film speed and aperture. In shutter priority mode, TV, the user controls the shutter speed while the camera decides an appropriate aperture. This mode is helpful in situations where shutter speed is vital, such as shooting sports. In aperture priority mode, the user controls the aperture setting while the camera selects an appropriate shutter speed. This mode is helpful in situations where the user would like to control how much of the photograph is in focus. In manual mode, the user controls all camera settings: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. In order to help the user determine a proper exposure, the camera's light meter evaluates the scene to see how much light is available. The exposure level indicator tells the user if the selected shutter speed and aperture are appropriate. The settings are appropriate when the mark is at 0. If the exposure level indicator mark is below 0, the photograph will be too dark or underexposed. In this case, the user should choose a slower shutter speed, a larger aperture, or in some cases, a higher ISO speed. If the exposure level indicator mark is above the 0, the photograph will be too bright or overexposed. In this case, the user should choose a faster shutter speed, a smaller aperture, or a lower ISO speed. In some lighting situations, such as photographing subjects lit by a spotlight, the standard metering mode does not produce a good exposure. To account for different lighting, there are 4 metering modes the user can choose by pressing the Q button, using the up and down arrows to select metering, the left and right arrows to select a mode, and pressing Set to make the selection. Evaluative metering, the camera's standard setting, looks at the brightness of the entire frame and works well in most lighting situations. In partial metering mode, the camera evaluates the brightness in just the area of the frame inside the autofocus points. This is helpful when the background is much brighter than the subject. Spot metering mode is used when a very small subject, such as an actor's face being lit by a spotlight, is much brighter or much darker than the background. The camera looks at only the brightness of the area in the very center of the frame. Center-weighted metering looks mostly at the brightness in the center of the frame, but also accounts for the brightness in the rest of the frame. To focus on the subject, press the shutter button halfway down. While the shutter button is pressed halfway, the user can move the camera without losing the autofocus lock. There are 3 autofocus modes for shooting still images. One-shot mode is used for shooting still subjects. Once the shutter button is pressed halfway, the focus is locked. AI servo mode is used for when the subject is moving, such as in sports. When the shutter button is pressed halfway, the camera focuses on the subject and will continue to adjust the focus as long as the button is pressed halfway. AI focus mode is used in situations where the subject is still and then begins to move. After the shoot, remove your memory card from the camera and place it in your memory card case. Then, place your camera in the camera case and don't forget your tripod. Finally, be sure to back up your images as soon as possible and recharge your batteries for the next shoot.